the story is that there's these two women who work together and live together for like 30 years. They're saving for this retirement trip to come down to Disney. And they hit retirement age, and they make the long road trip from way up north. And as they get into Central Florida, they pass through this town, and one goes, "Oh, that's an interesting name, Kissimmee." And the other one says, "No, it's not Kissimmee, it's Kissimmee." And she says, "No, it's not Kissimmee, it's Kissimmee." They go back and forth, Kissimmee, 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 Kissimmee. And 30 minutes, they're arguing all the way through. And finally, they pull over to a fast food restaurant, and they go in, and the one goes up to the clerk and says, "Are you from here?" And she says, "Yeah." And she says, "Great, you got to settle this argument for us." The other one says, "Yeah, settle this argument and say it really slow so my friend can understand you. Tell her, where are we?" And the woman says, "Burger King." It might not hit you till the way home. You guys are a little tired tonight. Religion, and particularly our tradition, the Christian tradition, can spend so much time arguing about how we pronounce heaven. That is what it is and how you get there and what you have to know, believe, and do in order to have it. And here's the verse that proves my understanding. And, well, no, here's the verse that proves my understanding. And I'm right about heaven. No, I'm right about heaven. Well, you go to hell. We can spend so much time arguing about how we pronounce heaven that we miss heaven where we actually are. And that's sort of, I think, what Jerry was saying. And for Jesus and for the prophets that influenced Jesus, that's the only heaven that there is. Where we are. We said a couple weeks ago in part 1 of this teaching that wine becomes a symbol of heaven, and heaven is imagined in 3 dimensions of shalom. There's a sense of integrity or oneness among people, with God, and with the earth. And wine becomes a symbol of that integrity. Shalom, peace. Catherine of Siena says it's heaven all the way to heaven and hell all the way to hell. The idea is there isn't here and there, this and something else, that in this experience, we experience the fullness of heaven or hell. For the prophets, the image of heaven is absolute wholeness on earth. Peace, plenty, justice, goodness, life, vitality. It is the best. And when it's there, wine is flowing, the symbol of heaven. The prophets don't locate heaven somewhere else in space and time, not somewhere to which we one day will fly away, but this place in which God's presence is experienced in greater and more increasing dimensions. For the prophets, heaven is here. There is nowhere in the entire Bible that says that heaven is somewhere else. There is not one verse in the entirety of the scriptures that says the final resting place of humans is anywhere other than here. And people will challenge that and go, what about John 14? Behold, I go and prepare a place for you. No, this is Jewish wedding language. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. 2 Peter 3, it sounds like heaven language, but it's not. It's actually referring to creation language in Genesis 1 and 2. Philippians 3, pretty overt. Our citizenship is in heaven. This is actually propaganda subverting the Roman imperial project. It's not talking about a literal heaven somewhere else. 2 Corinthians 5, no, that's reconciliation language. 1 Corinthians 15, no, that's incarnation and resurrection language. On and on and on. There's all these verses that have been grabbed and used when people bring the idea of an otherworldly afterlife heaven somewhere else. You can find verses that seem like they might be talking about that, but that's not what they're actually referring to. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that the final resting place of humans is somewhere else. Now let me say this. There is a need for me and for us to be pastorally sensitive. And here's what I mean. Erin lost a friend a couple weeks ago. She went to the memorial yesterday. My mom's lifelong friend, Joe Noble, died this week after fighting debilitating illness for 10 years. It was horrific. Kate shared at Art and Soul on Wednesday about the miscarriages that she had when she was first getting involved with Collective. I did a funeral Wednesday night for a 19-year-old. Who was hit by a car. So we can't just reframe heaven and toss out the hope that people need in the face of the insecurity and the confusion regarding what it is that happens when we die. There is this sense, this imagination in the scriptures that when we die now, our soul or our spirit is with God, a sense that we somehow return to the source. Now, are we conscious of that? Do I experience Ben-ness after I die? To what extent am I even aware? Do I have an understanding or an experience of my own identity? Or is my soul, is my life energy diffused back into the source of all energy, back into God? Who knows? Who knows? Anyone that claims to is bullshitting you. We don't know. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. But we say things like on Ash Wednesday, ashes to ashes. and dust to dust. This is not primarily an ancient scientific treatise on decomposition. And sure, we're literally carbon-based stardust, but this is actually poetry. This is wisdom. This is metaphor. We return to God. We return to the source. God is the ground of being, and we both come from and return to that ground from which we come. Now, we spent a ton of time on this in the season of Lent, preparing for death well by living well now, so I'm not going to camp out on that stuff about the afterlife, other than to say this. If pointing out that the Bible and that Jesus doesn't understand heaven as somewhere else in space-time, but here on earth, now and still to come in its fullness, regardless of what that means about the absolute mystery of life after death, if that is troubling, if that's disturbing for whatever reason, if losing the idea of heaven somewhere else when you die is harshing your mellow or disrupting your zen or whatever, if you need that, if you need heaven when you die somewhere else, it might actually be worthwhile to examine not only that you feel like you need it, but instead, why do you need that? Why do you need that? Examine your own anxiety. Examine that need. Examine maybe your insecurity. And again, not that I have the answer, but I think it's worth asking that question. Because if the life Jesus is convinced is possible is about freedom, if it's about integrity, if it's about what saves us, then let it free us from, let it reintegrate these split realities, let it save us also from dependence upon and anxiety about certainty regarding the afterlife. It is mystery. It's mystery. We don't know. We have hope. We can hold ourselves open to that mystery. But I think faith whispers to us to look away from preoccupation with the afterlife and to make good and deep and true and meaningful investments in this life. To live now the kind of lives that we hope will go on in God's good world forever. Lives that are marked by shalom, marked by integrity, wholeness, with God, with people, with the earth. Otherwise, we may find that we arrive at our death with the perfect pronunciation of Kissimmee, these beautiful ideas of heaven, and have totally missed the Burger King of our lives. We may have totally missed where we've been standing the entire time. Have it your way. So, shalom. We laid some groundwork last time. Heaven is an integrated reality. Soil, sun, wind, water, cultivating, planting, vineyards, innovating, living, sustaining, eating, loving, celebrating, growing, dying, the human experience. We're made to be intimately connected to our surroundings, to the earth in which we live, our neighbors among who we live. We just got back from a few days away with the Josephs over in Venice, and we do this naturally when we go on vacation, right? It was spectacular. You wouldn't believe the setup. We booked a chilly, windowless room lit by fluorescent lights, white tile floors, sterile blue walls. We sat in uncomfortable cubicle chairs, and we played computer games while we drank Red Bull and ate Twinkies. Absolute greatest vacation of all time. No, right? We don't do that. For some reason, when we book vacation time, we do something different. For us, we went to the beach. We went for walks in a nature preserve. We sat in a bird sanctuary and watched wildlife. We got fresh air. We watched the sunset. We ate fresh food. We put our toes in the sand. How many of you, for absolutely no reason, if you're on a beach, you just dig a hole? Anyone? Like, I don't know if it's just with kids, but like if you're sitting on a beach, you dig a hole. That's apparently what you do. I don't know. That's a part of the human thing. So we got too much sun. We swam in the water. We felt wind on our face. When our lives disintegrate us, apparently it's a part of our natural rest response to reintegrate. We reconnect with others. We reconnect with the soil. We reconnect with the source, with God. Heaven is an integrated reality. And knowing now that wine has become a symbol of heaven for the prophets and for Jesus, of this integrity, of this wholeness, let's hear this passage, a very familiar story. Who's got our reading from John 2? I do. Come on, Dan. Bring it.
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you.
Our reading today is from John 2. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, What concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Now draw some out and take it up to the brim." He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servant who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Thanks, Dan. If you're wondering if matter matters, those boots and leather pants matter. So well done. All right, just real quick. Ta-da, what would be your first miracle and why? So this is like the coming out miracle of Jesus in the Gospel of John. This is the first one that sort of, he comes on the scene, his first public foray. Any thoughts? Anybody got just a quick one? It's okay. Some of you think about this. There's Dan. Yeah.
Everybody would have K-pop boy hair.
K-pop boy hair. That's right. All right. And they would see the glory of Dan and believe.
There you go.
That's right. Anybody else? Coming out miracle? Yeah, Bill. Heal somebody. Yeah, seems like a pretty solid one. Yeah, John.
We all were miracles when we were born.
All right. Recognizing we're all miracles. I didn't think of the answer to this, so I'm not going to answer.
Should you be aware of the miracles you perform?
Ooh, good question. Should you be aware of the miracles you perform? I don't know. It's a good question for another sermon. So, weddings in the ancient Near East. These things would last, these were ragers, right? This is not like weddings today where you go and it's a few hours and like you sit there and wait. And it feels like forever until they cut the cake, but they finally cut the cake and then you eat the cake and leave. These lasted days, sometimes weeks. People took off work. They had to travel from neighboring towns, right? They didn't have cars and highways. So this was like a huge investment of time and cash. This was a rager, all right? This is actually where we get the biblical precedent for open bar. It comes from the story. So these are major events and actually what's called an honor and shame culture. There's a strong sense of familial honor and legacy. And so the 6 jars, 20 to 30 gallons, between 120 and 180 gallons of wine indicates that this party probably included people from neighboring villages because Cana wasn't that big. So the whole regional reputation of this place is on the line, the family, the town. They can't just run to the liquor store, right? There is no booze delivery service. We're thinking about starting boozestork.com, but anyway, that's another thing for another time. So this might forever then become the family or the town, the wedding, where so-and-so threw a feast and they didn't have the food and they didn't have the wine to support the party. So generations to come could be shamed for this failure, right? This oversight. So there's a lot on the line for the family and the town, but it's significant that Jesus is here for a couple reasons. He saves this family and maybe the town from like social suicide. And I think this is worth noting because this actually gets overlooked a lot. Often Jesus' healing in the Gospels are as much social healing as they are physical healing. Often the malady that he heals is actually a thing that separates the person from the community, from their religious practice, and so separates them from God. So he's healing, and it serves actually to reintegrate someone into community with their neighbors, into community with God, shalom, wholeness. And here we might say he does this by saving the wedding, right? In an honor and shame culture, he saves the social standing of the family, maybe the entire town, maybe the region. We said also at Occupy, it's interesting that the first miracle is Jesus making wine to keep a party going. It's joyful, You get the sense that people wanted to be around him. They invited him. Somebody said at Occupy, and I thought this was great. Talk about commentary on the Bible. They invited him to a party for a reason. Right? I don't know if we need to know a whole lot more about Jesus than that. They invited him to a party for a reason. Aaron was sharing, C.S. Lewis says, joy is the serious business of heaven. So apparently Jesus is about the heavenly business of joy, of feast, of celebration. The miracle is about enjoying the time that you have here, because where is heaven? Because where is heaven? Okay, cool. Excellent. At least one person's listening. Now, this is a wedding. And we've spoken about the fact that wine means for the prophets, and throughout Jewish history, wine becomes a picture of heaven. But what is a wedding a picture of in Jewish history? Any guesses? That's right, hell. No, it's not. Weddings are also a picture of heaven, more specifically of the oneness, the shalom between God and people. In Jewish history, the 10 Commandments, many of the rabbis, the commentaries from the rabbis, the 10 Commandments were seen as a marriage, the wedding, the union of God and people. In fact, if you look at the Hebrew text, the word commands doesn't actually even show up anywhere around the story of the 10 Commandments. It's actually the 10 words, and the rabbis say it's really more like the 10 vows. People make vows to God. God makes vows to people about how they're going to live together and how they will be in relationship with one another, which is why the rabbis say the first vow, the first word, is you can't have any other lovers. This won't work, right? You can have no other gods before me. This isn't going to work if you take other lovers. This is like the wedding of God and people. And they go on to use this really romantic imagery, the first kiss, right? Where Israel goes up on the mountain and God bends down onto the mountain, right, for this embrace. It's loaded with this wedding imagery. So for the rest of the Bible, we have God saying things like Israel was the bride of my youth. Israel has been an unfaithful and adulterous generation. And because Israel had been unfaithful, the union was broken, and the people lived with this powerful hope that at some point, God and people would be reunited. They would come back together. So Jesus at this wedding. And at the center of the wedding, a symbol about the union of God and people, we have Jesus and wine, the symbol of heaven on earth. All of this to say, the point isn't to figure out the magic show. How did he do it? Where did the extra wine come from? The point isn't the party trick. It's the power of the world and the kind of life that's being pointed to, that's loaded within these symbols. The text says that this is the first sign, right? And the point of a sign isn't the sign. The point of a sign is what the sign points to. We don't climb up signposts, right? We walk the paths that they point us down. Jesus isn't David Blaine, and Jesus isn't Mr. Wizard. This isn't a magic trick. It's a prophetic sign. Or we could say for John, this is parabolic storytelling. People are coming close to God. Heaven is coming close to earth. Wholeness, wellness, goodness, integrity is coming. And Jesus' presence gets connected with the union of God and people, with the inbreaking of heaven on earth. And Jesus gets in trouble for this, right? The scandalous blurring of these lines, of the binaries and these categories, what we might call the sacred and profane, or the sacred and common, which originally just meant inside the temple, sacred, or outside the temple, profane. The idea being what was in and what was out, temple, religion, orthodoxy, rules, and then everything else. But Jesus comes healing and helping and eating with and touching and talking to all the wrong people at all the wrong times, all the profane types, the misfits and the outcasts who lived in the commons. And then when he's crucified, the story is the temple curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred, where God dwelled, from the profane, was ripped from top to bottom. Random detail in the story. There's not really any other reason to put it than this. On the one hand, there is no longer now a divider. People can get in to God, right? The Holy of Holies where God dwells. But that's actually kind of still the same old game, because people still have to get to where God is. And sure, we could go, well, now there's no boundary. Anyone can get into God, but we still have to get there, to the temple, to the center, to the special room, to the place where God is. But maybe on a deeper level, this isn't just people get into God, but God can come out. And when the temple curtain is torn, they realize there's actually nothing in there. For years and years and years, they've been tying a rope around the waist of the priest, and the priest would go in there once a year right? And they tied the rope because in case the priest was killed by the glory of God, they could pull the priest out. The temple curtain rips and they go in and there's nothing in there. There is no God in the special room. I think part of what Jesus does by challenging and merging and dissolving these binaries between heaven and earth and God and people, dissolving the sacred from the profane, when he eats with whores and touches lepers and heals the marginalized and befriends the hated and breaks his own religious boundaries, and ultimately when the temple curtain is torn, he reveals this scandalous truth. No, that's not what I wanted. There we go. What does that say? Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3. How come you guys don't agree? God is nowhere. God is now here. It is only if and only when God ceases to be confined to a single place, temple, or religion that God is free to be experienced as present in and with all things within God. It is only when God is nowhere that God is now here. The all-encompassing Spirit in whom all that is. And if this is true, if this is God, then heaven can't be elsewhere or otherwise because we are already within the Spirit in whom all that is. We can and should seriously consider cultivating a practice of deeper consciousness of this kind of life and experience here and now, but we can't merely believe things in order to escape it. And I would argue we shouldn't want to. If we want to escape, we've actually missed all of the gifts of the Christian tradition. When it came to the early Christian practice of this view of reality, heaven, shalom, union with God, it shows up over and over and over in the New Testament as warnings against a particular kind of heresy called Gnosticism. This was an early toxic heresy that skewed many things. Among them, this is what Bill was talking about, it separated body from spirit. Body or materiality was bad, spirit was understood as good. This is the influence of Plato rather than Jesus. It made special knowledge the key to evacuation. If you know the right thing, you can get up and out. You can be gone from the pains of this mortal coil, escape this life, go to heaven when you die. They've got the streets of gold and the gates and all that stuff. Over the course of church history, this heresy continues to show up when ultimate reality is split, disintegrated, and disembodied. It shows up in specific lines of thought, like Jansenism, Platonism, Cartesian dualism, over and over and over. But remember, for the prophets who say heaven is houses and vineyards and work and sex and cities and economies, and Jesus, whose central grounding presence is called incarnation, not only the divinity of Jesus, but the humanity of God, the divine in the human experience, the non-dual oneness of sacred and common, inseparable, united, integrated. Matter matters. Matter matters. There is no heaven when things are split. If it is escape, if it's evacuation, if it's division, if it's elsewhere, if it's binary, and you feel like you're having to choose here or there, it's not heaven because heaven is an integrated reality. And so this reframes all of the language we use, especially religious language. Just an example. Salvation, rather than being about believing the special knowledge we have to believe in order to escape to heaven somewhere else when we die, let me know, is this familiar to you? There is no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. Who's heard this? Right, what's this from? Just in general, what's it from? What book? No, not even, just the whole book. The Bible, right. Okay, yeah, I know, it's 66 books, but yeah. Yes, it is from the Bible. But first, this was actually a Roman imperial slogan about the might of their army. Rome would say to people, because of the strength of their army that no one could defeat, there is no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. And so the early Christian community actually turned this into anti-Roman propaganda to subvert the Roman imperial violence, oppression, and domination they were experiencing. Salvation, for them, wasn't a belief that you believed in your head to get to heaven when you die. It was all about the way you lived in opposition to this inhuman, violent empire in the real world. And so for us, maybe salvation is more like dismantling racism. rescuing the environment, getting clean water to people who need it, ending sexual slavery, restoring economies, undoing systemic oppression, disrupting the prison industrial complex, challenging capital punishment, not just championing the cause, but creating the reality of an experience of equity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities. When I was accused of heresy, and I shared this a few weeks ago, this has just been about a month, maybe 5 weeks, I was accused of heresy. It had to do with this exact line of thinking, which is pretty crazy because I had already planned on preaching this prior to that. The universe is just. I got these questions, right? Would I, and these were directly made to me. This is how it was determined that I was a heretic. Would I say the right words? Would I confess the right special knowledge? Would I preach the acceptable orthodoxy such that I could be saved, so that I could go to heaven when I die? Did I believe that Jesus was the only way to heaven somewhere else when I die? Did I believe the Bible is the holy authoritative text that has the clear answers, magic spell, or whatever it is that gets me to heaven somewhere else when I die? This obsession with beliefs required to escape to heaven somewhere else when we die at the expense of the call to live and practice a faith that grows in the consciousness of and participates in bringing heaven to earth now, this is actually one of the oldest heresies in the book, and it is in our book. And that's where it's called heresy. This is the same Gnostic dualism that's being challenged by the prophets. This is the same dualism that's being subverted by Jesus when he deconstructs this split between sacred and common. And it is the good news of the wine at the wedding that at the heart of the Jesus story is an invitation to live in the oneness. The shalom where heaven is here, where God and people are united here, where sacred and common are one. I love in the story that the master, the host, notices that this is the good wine, or this is the best wine. Because I think very often, and this really hits on what Jerry was sharing, we tend to think of heaven, we tend to think of spirituality, and even to think of miracles as being totally other. Totally other. Outside of the realm of our experience, outside of the realm of this world, outside of all of our natural laws. And so what happens is we end up preserving the split between sacred and common. Right? There's everything day to day, and then there's like the inbreaking of heaven, or miracles, or spirituality. But here, in the story, they already had wine. And apparently the wine they had already had was totally fine because they drank all of it. And they enjoyed it. They were definitely buzzed. The host thinks that they're all drunk. The point is, the wine that Jesus is involved in isn't a whole other thing. It's not as if they'd never had wine, right? This is like a dry wedding, and all of a sudden Jesus shows up and it's like, oh my God, there's wine for everybody. No, they already had wine. They had that experience. It was fine. They drank all of it. It's worth noting that the wine that Jesus is involved in, the note is that it's the best. It's the best version of the wine they already had and they already appreciated. And again, if this wine is symbolic of heaven, the wedding is symbolic of the oneness between God and people, it is not a brand new, unknown reality. It's the reality we already know, that we already appreciate, we have already tasted, simply taken to its fullest expression. This wine from water, it's not something other than wine. Heaven is not something other than this world. It's the same thing, same place, same human experience, but the best. The fullest, most whole, true, just, and good. And this is important. Because remember, I asked if heaven is the carrot, what's the stick? It's important that this understanding is non-binary. It is not good and bad. Instead, it's good and best. Because drinking lesser quality wine is not hell. It's just a lesser experience of the best. Living in a world that is less than the perfection of shalom, less than the perfection of integrity among people and God and the earth, it is not necessarily hell. Now, for sure, for some people it's hell. Not having clean drinking water is hell. The point is, this wine and this wedding become a sign that points us down a path into the fullness of the integrity of the world, of our own lives, heaven and earth coming together, God and people coming together, the sacred and the common, the same thing, the same place. And how does this happen? There's actually no part in the entire story where it says Jesus turns water into wine. It's actually sort of a rip that he gets credit for it. It doesn't show up anywhere in the story. There is no direct agency in the text, right? I don't know about you, I like to imagine, because I do this sort of like fan fiction thing, right? Where Jesus is backstage and like touches the big jar of water and it goes from clear water to like this brilliant, awesome yellowtail. I'm very snobby when it comes to wine, clearly. Merlot, is that a thing? I like wine. What it does say, so it doesn't say Jesus turns water into wine, even though anybody who reads the story goes, yeah, well, Jesus turns water into wine. What it says is that the servants did what Jesus asked. And it wasn't spiritual, and it wasn't miraculous, and it wasn't noble, and it wasn't heroic. They simply filled vessels with water. That's all we hear in the story. They fill vessels with water. They take whatever's in the vessels out to the host. They fill vessels with water, and wine happens. They simply do as Jesus asked them to do, and something significant happens. Maybe when we simply fill vessels with water, wine happens. Maybe when we simply do some of the things that Jesus has asked us to do, maybe heaven happens. So apart from filling vessels with water, and we'll say drilling wells for the water impoverished, what we're going to do next week at Wine to Water, apart from that, what is it? What are the simple things that Jesus has asked us to do? I don't care what you believe about God or religion. If you're open to the fact that Jesus says the best possible life, the fullest expression of humanity, is achieved through a certain way of being, a form of life in the world, what does he say to do? Love one another. Love your neighbor. Love your enemies. That's tough. Pray for the ones who persecute you. Turn the other cheek. Feed the hungry. Clothe the naked. Care for the poor, the orphan, the widow. Visit the prisoner. Let your light shine. Deal with your anger. Keep your word. If you're gonna pray, pray in the closet. Stop worrying. Stop judging. Ask, seek, knock. Do for other people what you would want them to do for you. When we simply fill vessels with water, wine happens. Heaven happens. What if we did these simple things that Jesus asks his followers to do? Not believe abstract ideas about God or about heaven, but concrete ways of living. Might heaven happen here? Another thing Jesus asks his followers to do is to break bread together. Man, that's going to be so low on the rip scale. To break bread together. That was the toughest one ever, if anyone's wondering. That could have been pre-cut. I would have looked so much better. And to share the cup. And to remember. And what if the question isn't, when we consider and remember and eat the bread and drink the cup, what if the question isn't, how do I get to heaven when I die? Right? Well, you believe the right things about the bread and the wine. What if the question instead is, what does heaven look like on earth? What does God look like in humanity? Not ideas and beliefs, but body and blood, not believed and defended for the certainty of our fate someday, but broken and poured out for the healing of the world. He asks us to eat and to drink and to remember with no promise about what we might experience when we come to this table together. Simply that when we do this, we will have life. Life. Heaven here. God with us. Life. The table of this life has been set for us tonight. As always, it's open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.